Hi, and welcome to the Cosmic Prayer. My name is Laura Topper, and of course, I'm here every single week shining the light on prayer, what prayer means, through New Thought Media Network. On New Thought Media Network, this incredible focus ministry that has an idea and a vision that is so wonderful, bringing conversations just like this to you every single day of the week. Conversations, understandings, teachings, unraveling the truth so that we get to understand the wisdom in our own hearts. And today I'm just so excited because on the show I have invited a wonderful super guest, somebody that I have that's recently come into my awareness, and I reached out to and asked him if he would be the super guest here, and he said yes, which I'm very, very excited about. Dr. Eben Alexander the third is somebody who has an incredible understanding of the divine consciousness, this ultimate, the infinite, whatever it is we choose to call it, God, the divine presence, creative intelligence. There are so many ways that we can call this, label it, name it. And yet we know there is this one thing that is happening right now. And Dr. Eben has experienced this for himself in a very direct way. And he's here to come to talk today from his perspective of his near-death experience, and as a neurosurgeon and as an author and a speaker and a teacher and a guide. He has so much to share on the topic of consciousness and what consciousness truly is, his understanding of it, and how prayer informs his life. So I'm really, really excited to be here with Dr. Eben, for him to be here joining us all the way from Virginia while I'm here in the UK. Welcome, Dr. Eben Alexander. Welcome to the Cosmic Prayer today.
Well, Laura, thank you so much for having me on. It's great to be with you on the Cosmic Prayer today.
It's wonderful to be here with you. And the piece that really caught my attention initially when I saw you and started reading about you and your experiences and your amazing books, which we're going to get into in a while, is that you have come through this experience of a near-death experience as a neurosurgeon, as somebody so highly esteemed in your field, with all of the work that you've done over the years as a neurosurgeon and a lecturer and a teacher, and understanding God maybe from one perspective, and then this experience happening for you. And I can only imagine, I can't imagine what that must have felt like, but I really appreciate you speaking on that for a little just before we begin, because I would like then to weave in how prayer has kind of guided you through this, if at all. So
yeah, it's been an amazing journey. Now, I think it's important to point out to people that when I grew up in North Carolina, raised in the 60s and 70s. My father was very influential in my life. My father had served as a combat surgeon in the Second World War. He had a very strong belief in God and power of prayer. In fact, I still have at my bedside the little pocket Bible that he had with him all through his time in the Pacific Theater during World War II. And I've heard references from soldiers who were with him about how every night he'd take out his little Bible and do a little reading. Now, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and even though my father was also very scientific, I mean, that's kind of what led in his influence on me. He was the head of a neurosurgical training program. He was very knowledgeable about cosmology, physics, neuroscience, all these things. And this beautiful belief in prayer and in God and heaven that he had. I mean, all of it was fine. There was never a conflict. But like so many who grew up in the 60s and 70s, I always knew that science was the pathway to truth, but I mistakenly believed that materialist science was, the be all and end all of knowledge, and that materialist science, conventional kind of Newtonian deterministic materialist science, really is clueless about consciousness. It's what's known as the hard problem of consciousness,
Yes.
which really is an impossible problem for materialism to try and pretend that the brain is somehow creating consciousness purely out of physical matter. And the modern revolution of consciousness is not going that way at all, but informed
No.
by the depths of things like quantum physics, hard problem of consciousness, philosophy of mind, and the binding problem, as well as parapsychology and all the evidence for non-local consciousness. The modern scientific revolution fully acknowledges the power of consciousness and human free will, even though those are deep and challenging issues to explain. Uh, it's very apparent in the emerging science that I've learned since in the 13 years since my coma experience is really the dominant emerging view of science. And it's not materialistic and it's not deterministic. This is an extraordinary shift in our scientific understanding. And I'm so glad that I've been able to participate in it, but it has everything to do with prayer and everything to do with our free will. That materialist science that I had worshiped before my coma, and I don't use that word lightly, would proudly tell you no one even has free will. So how can you expect, if you don't have free will, that your prayers would ever lead anywhere? But I can tell you that I've also learned to have tremendous trust in the universe, and that's something we can get into. But NDEs, the whole
Yes.
literature on NDEs and these experiences uh, can help us generate a tremendous amount of trust that the highest and best good will unfold in this world. So it's been an extraordinary journey. It has everything to do with prayer and the power of kind of the free will of our higher soul. And I'm glad we're here for this discussion.
Oh, this is amazing. I'd just like to kind of rewind a little bit, because you said in there that you you realize that materialism, is not the way, that the hard problem cannot be solved. How can we create something out of nothing? And I wondered if you were realizing that before you had your experience, this direct experience, this near-death experience, or
No,
was it that?
I would say it was quite revolutionary because I really bought into the way our conventional scientific materialism puts the argument together. There's something in there
Mhm.
called promissory materialism, which was referred to by Sir John Eccles, who, famous neurophysiologist who won a Nobel Prize, but that's what he called it, was this kind of blind faith that if we just keep studying the brain, somehow, someday, we'll finally figure out how it might generate consciousness, even though the more we pursue that scientifically, the more elusive that goal actually seems. So that promissory materialism is a very vague and empty promise. And especially as we go into in our book, for example, Living in a Mindful Universe, my third book that was co-written with my partner, Karen Newell, we go into deep detail about this. But what it shows is that you cannot explain consciousness and the brain mind connection through any kind of materialist following of the data. It just doesn't work, especially when you bring in things, for example, like quantum physics, which very deeply screams at us that consciousness is fundamental in the universe and not derived from physical matter. And not only that, but we seem to be sharing one mind. That's a very deep and profound lesson coming out of quantum physics. But also, there's this tremendous field of parapsychology with all the evidence for non local consciousness. For example,
Right.
telepathy, remote viewing, psychokinesis, distance healing, power of prayer, precognition and presentiment. And then, of course, all the after death communications, deathbed visions that have an extraordinary kind of basis in reality once you study them more deeply. And of course, all the past life memories in children suggestive of reincarnation, for example, studied at the University of Virginia over the last 6 decades. These are all huge fields of study relevant to consciousness. And all of them are telling us consciousness is not primarily created by the brain. Memories are not stored in the brain. And these are such extraordinary claims, and yet they're fully borne out by the empirical data and the emerging rational argument supporting this scientific discussion. So scientific materialism is dead and gone. It's just that many people who worship it have not yet read the memo.
I love that. So, Dr. Ernest Holmes, who synthesized the work of many, 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 many wisdom teachers from from the ages. That was his body of work for his life, and he pulled together so much and created the science of mind and spirit as a textbook and as a philosophy and a way of living. And if we go back through the root of what he created, he's tapping into what has been known for millennia, and yet for some reason, and he always would say, we cannot get along without science. He was looking forward to the day when science and spirituality were best friends rather than arguing with each other. Right. Because in the one mind, science is it too. It's all the divine expressing. We can't separate off and say science isn't God.
Right.
It's still God.
Exactly.
And yet it's the other way, from his perspective, it's the other way around. It's consciousness is here first, creating itself, expressing and experiencing itself as everything. And so exactly. Would you say we need to get to this kind of, where scientists and spirituality teachers and wisdom teachers are actually having these discussions now more than ever to get even closer to this understanding where everyone can accept this?
Well, I think that's very much what is happening. For example, in this whole question of the afterlife, is there an afterlife? There was actually a contest last year that weighs in very powerfully in answering that question. It was a contest that was hosted by Robert Bigelow. He's the head of Bigelow Aerospace and the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies in Las Vegas. And he had a personal interest in this because his own son had committed suicide a few years ago. He had recently lost his wife. So he had a big interest, and he also had some money to put up for prizes. And in this contest, the question was, what is the best scientific evidence for the continuation of consciousness after permanent bodily death? And he received a tremendous response of more than 1,200 people interested in submitting essays, but they demanded that people had to show a rigorous history of at least 5 years of personal scientific study of this question. And when they did that, they ended up getting 204 essays that were all submitted last summer. And they had 6 judges who were very well educated and positioned and chosen to be judges of these kind of papers, very scientific and reflective minds who could answer this question. Those were the judges. And they selected these 29 winners that received monetary awards. And all 29 essays are available to the public right now for free. So no excuse not to read it. No longer any willful ignorance.
Where do we find those?
Go to bigelowinstitute.org. bigelowinstitute.org, and there they are. If you just start with the first place winning essay by Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove, you can see he's the only person in the United States who ever received a PhD, a doctorate in the study of parapsychology. He received it from Berkeley in May of 1980. Right. And you can see where all these years of work have led him. It's an extraordinarily powerful essay. And in fact, I don't think any rational thinking person can read that essay and not come away of failing to see the reality not only of the afterlife, but of reincarnation. I mean, the evidence is extremely powerful. And then there are 28 other essays that come at it from all different directions, but they're all making the same point. Don't pretend that, materialist science has anything to say about this. Science does, the science of consciousness. But these essays go into great detail to make this case very strongly. And it's high time we did, because this world needs to wake up to the reality of this, and that we're actually spiritual beings in a spiritual universe. That's the deep scientific truth. And certainly when it comes to healing and prayer and the highest good for all, this kind of knowledge is very helpful to get us on the right pathway towards healing this world.
Yes. So thank you so much for sharing that, because I think this ties in really beautifully with your own personal experience and what happened for you. And I'd really be interested in understand. I mean, I can never understand it, but just hearing from your perspective what it was that like after experiencing that, what changed for you? If you had a
Everything.
near-death
It was a
experience, what
radical
changed?
change. But the other important thing, for anyone who hasn't read the book Proof of Heaven, that's where all this story is told. That book, there's a second book, The Map of Heaven, which is more about the commonality and general overlap of these experiences. But the real follow-up to Proof of Heaven in terms of my personal story is the third book, Living in a Mindful Universe. There are a lot of other important features of my personal journey that are laid out there. But what it all really shows is I had to get into this state of very near death. I mean, extraordinarily near death. And when you read the book, and not only that, there's a medical case report that came out in September of 2018. So almost 10 years after my coma. It was written by 3 doctors who were not involved in my care, but were absolutely fascinated by my recovery, which, basically is a medical miracle when you read the details of this. And that was something that some people missed early on, as much as I tried to point that out in Proof of Heaven. But these doctors made it very clear that my brain was far too damaged to have any kind of dream or hallucination. And that, of course, is one of the most powerful features of my journey, is that I
Right.
was not in a medically induced coma. The coma was caused by severe bacterial meningoencephalitis involving all the lobes of my brain. So there was no place for any kind of neocortex to survive and try and muster a little piece of conscious awareness. And modern neuroscience depends on the neocortex for all the details of conscious awareness. And yet mine was offline. And that's the point that the case report makes so clearly. The other key point to make about the case report is that the peer reviewers at the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases said, well, this case is absurd. These kind of patients, this sick with this documented damage, do not tend to come back with a full recovery. So how do you explain it? And that's when the 3 doctors who wrote the case report said it's because he had a near-death experience. Something
Ah,
about that experience seems to be related to this extraordinary recovery. And they could say that because there are other cases out there of near-death experiences associated with profound healing, like Anita Morjani, who had an advanced
yes.
stage 4 lymphoma. She was deep in coma, 85 pounds. She should have been dead within hours, but she had a profound NDE back in February 2006 when she was taken to an ER in Hong Kong. And she ended up having a complete recovery from her lymphoma. It just disappeared. She was told that in her spiritual journey before she came back, that the cancer would go away, and it did. Likewise, Dr. Mary C. Neal, orthopedic surgeon who had a profound NDE back in the late 90s during a kayaking expedition in South America. She had a warm water drowning. She was under for more than 30 minutes. And anyone in medicine will tell you that doesn't result in a good outcome. And yet she was brought to the surface dead. She was resuscitated. And she ended up having a full recovery. And I presented with her before, and she's beautifully recovered from it. So NDEs have a profound association with miraculous healing. Any of us in medicine should pay attention to that. And that's
Hmm.
where I think my journey was so important, especially because the other thing, that I mentioned about that case report is they make it clear my brain was in no shape to do anything other than the meagless trickle of consciousness. Like, for example, my earthworm's eye view, that teeny little trickle of consciousness I had at the beginning of my experience before it erupted into this extraordinary ultra reality in these spiritual realms, which again happened at a time when my medical records showed my brain could not have made that happen. It came from somewhere else. And also, for those who try and say, well, the memories formed when I was coming out of coma or when I was going in or something like that, when my brain was a little healthier, that is completely belied by the facts of the case and what I witnessed and how it's all explained in Proof of Heaven. The faces I saw at the very end that served as a veridical time anchor to prove to me that the vast majority of the coma journey had to happen between days 1 and 4 or days 1 and 5. And I explain all that of a 7-day coma. And the reason that's important, again, is because of the documented damage. Uh, the hardcore scientific evidence in my case, including that case report, makes it very clear my brain was not creating the experience I went through. It occurred at the time I thought it did when my brain could not have had anything to do with it, other than being out of the way. And that's something we discussed, for example, in Living a Mindful Universe. The example we give is all the recent papers on psychedelic drug experiences, psilocybin, LSD,
Yes.
DMT. Now, I'm not recommending anybody go take those substances because I believe meditation is a much better way to get in touch with these deep truths than the psychedelics. But an interesting thing about scientific study of those psychedelics is that your brain is turning off. And anyone who's ever taken psilocybin or LSD or DMT would think their brain is lighting up like a Christmas tree to support all the extraordinary phenomenal experience they encounter there. And yet that's not what happens. When you use functional MRI and magnetoencephalography to look at the brain, you find the brain is going dark. It's getting out of the way. That's exactly what my brain was doing with this severe case of meningoencephalitis. That's where it becomes very interesting from a scientific standpoint. That's why scientists around the world pay tremendous attention to my NDE and also to a lot of the work I've done since then in trying to make sense of it, because it aligns very deeply with where some of the leading scientists studying consciousness today are headed with their ideas about the nature of reality.
So I had an experience in 2012 in the labyrinth where it was not a near-death experience. It was more like an out-of-body spontaneous experience. It was not drug-induced. It was totally spontaneous, and it was the walk in the labyrinth that instigated it. And it was a 4-hour experience that I could not explain for 2 years, and still can't quite comprehend 10 years later. It's what's led me here. And I'm really hearing what you're saying about the brain. I could not, it wasn't an imaginary experience. It was a direct experience. So I wasn't thinking anything. It was happening for me and I couldn't control it. And I wonder, these experiences that happen, how you, in the books that you've written, because they're profound experiences and they're life-changing experiences, and they can't be explained as such. I mean, I'm just so honored that you've written your experience down in these 4 books or these 3 books, and the meditation journey that you take people on. How could you explain this to somebody if without the experience that they could get to that place?
Well, that's a beautiful question. It turns out that's what my partner Karen Newell and I do in our workshops around the world, is help
Ah,
people who haven't had near-death experiences to get into a mental state where they can start to share in that kind of expansion of their own awareness. And to do that, we use it's her company. It's called Sacred Acoustics. And for people who want to learn more, you can go to sacredacoustics.com. She has a free download, so you don't have to pay anything. 20-minute file that you can listen with headphones. I was first attracted to this form of differential frequency brainwave entrainment within a year and a half, 2 years after my coma. I'd read about 150 books on neuroscience, meditation, deep conscious states, spiritual epiphanies, trying to make sense of it. And I finally realized that if I was going to truly kind of get into this, I had to have an active program of going within. So I needed some form
right.
of meditation. Now, for me, prayer, earlier in my life, I found prayer to be valuable. But at this juncture, after my NDE, I thought I needed something more than just my attempts at prayer. And I thought that the binaural beat brainwave entrainment was very appealing to me as a neuroscientist, because There was work done in the late 20th century that suggested that these binaural beats were very powerful at engendering transcendental states of conscious awareness. I believe the reason they do that, and we talk about this a lot in our third book, in Living in a Mindful Universe, but I believe the reason they can do that is these sounds, unlike any other sound you might have heard of chant or anthem or hymn that might have engendered a profound transcendental state, remember that those sounds are all processed up in the neocortex and the acoustic lobes, acoustic cortex of the temporal lobes, in circuits that really have mainly evolved and developed in the last few million years in primates and Homo sapiens. That's totally different from where brainwave entrainment occurs from these differential frequencies. That occurs way down in the lower brainstem. And I think that's what makes such a tremendous difference, because it's
Right.
by manipulating that circuit in the lower brainstem. It's a circuit that arose more than 300 million years ago. There's a general principle in evolutionary biology that if you really want to understand some function, for example, consciousness, then what you want to do is look at the anatomic changes over time through evolution. Um, and in the brain, and so we look at the brain and we look at it through evolution. And what we find is that the circuits where these slight differences in frequency of the two coming to the two ears, where they're handled is way down in the superior olivary nucleus complex. It arose more than 300 million years ago. That's before mammals even walked this earth. In fact, it was originally there mainly to serve as a locating mechanism for sounds. Like when I hear something, a snap behind my head now, I know where it is because that
Right.
circuit does the calculation for me of arrival time of the sound going 1,000 feet per second to my two eardrums. So it can calculate down to microseconds of time, and it tells you where that sound is. Well, it turns out that very primitive circuit is also useful at driving these ascending kind of now signals from the what's called the reticular activating formation. I won't get into all the scientific details because I know the audience probably doesn't want to hear all that. But the bottom line is that by using something like sacred acoustics, you're actually able to modulate the ignition signals that are trying to uh, work kind of the thalamocortical arcs and all this stuff about neuroscience and consciousness in the neocortex, but you're simplifying it by taking over this lower circuit. And I believe that's why people can have such profound experiences. And if you go to sacredacoustics.com, you can check out her testimonial page and see people have had some extraordinary experiences of expanding into primary mind. And for me, it's just a beautiful form of centering prayer because I can get very, very deep. My ego mind is left far behind. And of course, that's one of the main goals of any kind of prayer or meditation is taking that little voice in
Right.
our head, the little ego mind, and putting it into timeout because all it does is cause trouble. And once you realize that there's a higher aspect of you that you can access through meditation and centering prayer that's much more connected with the rest of this universe and with this binding force of love and kindness and mercy and compassion as healing forces that bring us into wholeness, that's where all of a sudden meditation, and centering prayer start to really work to help us get into a much more kind of cohesive unity with the universe in manifesting our dreams.
Yes, because from my understanding, meditation will bring me to that place of connecting with the connective, with the infinite, with creator. So I'm coming away from even just being mindful, and
Right.
I'm actually opening up to the one mind, which we were talking about before we came on air, the one mind, and how
Yes.
um how now so much is opening up for us to really understand that there is one mind. And it's just I love it. And I just wonder what your technique is for actual prayer. Do you pray?
Well, for me, it's always in the form of this binaural beat brainwave entrainment.
Right.
Yes, it's a deep
Okay.
form of centering prayer. And by centering prayer, I'm kind of following the model of Thomas Keaton and
Yeah.
the other big proponents of centering prayer. Father Keaton out in Colorado was such a great contributor, and I had the blessing of being able to meditate and pray with him one time when I was visiting out there, and it was a very memorable experience. But for me, it really involves using sacred acoustics, as I said, which means headphones or earbuds, and you just letting my kind of mind and consciousness ride on the beautiful waves that come from the sacred acoustics tones. And I think the important thing to point out is kind of the way I came to acknowledge and then almost disacknowledge my conscious awareness in this process. Because early on, when I started all this back in about 2011, 2012, um, the first thing I would do was let the little voice in my head, my little ego mind, it could state a request or an intention or something, ask a question of the universe. But then I use the tones to help me put that little voice in my head into timeout. And that I think is the important thing, because so many of us, and certainly in our modern, rational, logical approach to science and understanding, we follow the breadcrumbs of our linguistic brain, assuming that if we understand everything from that viewpoint, it will then lead us to the proper knowledge and understanding. But in meditation and prayer, you don't really want to be following the little linguistic voice in the ego mind, because they're not going to help you. They can participate early on, but then they really have to go into timeout. And that's where I found the meditative tones of sacred acoustics to be so powerful, because by stating that intention or request in my linguistic brain and my ego mind at the very beginning, I can then say, okay, that's it. Now to ride the tones. And that's when I just focus on my breathing and on the tones and let the tones take me there. And before long, I don't even hear the tones anymore. I have gone so deep. But by putting that question out there, it's almost like setting up a stage for something like lucid dreaming, because what you find is once
Yes.
that ego mind is out of the way, you're kind of crossing the boundary of the veiling function, and that allows you to access not only your consciousness but also your unconscious mind, which is the seed ground for dreams and all of that kind of aspect. It's also a seed ground, I would say, for much of what transpires in psychedelic experiences, but also by traversing this veil and kind of getting out more into primordial mind, which is a very natural aspect of listening to these tones, we then start to let the universe feed us. And what I mean by that is, for example, we often talk about how great creative minds in history, like Albert Einstein, he would float around in a sailboat looking up at the clouds in the sky, just daydreaming and drifting for hours. And then the bright ideas would come into his mind. He would get into a hypnagogic state. He wasn't using his mathematical, rational, logical mind to think his way there. He was seeking tremendous insights from the universe that would come in this kind of blank state form of non-self, kind of hypnagogic interaction with the universe at large. And Karen and I often refer to Einstein and also Thomas Alva Edison. He was a great inventor. He worked for General Electric, had more patents than anybody in history working for that company. And he would put batteries or weights in his hands. And when he was really tired, he'd drift off and let those weights fall a few times. With those little micro naps, that little bit of hypnagogia, he would then have these brilliant insights. Robert Louis Stevenson had a simpler way to get to thoughts for his music, poetry, novels, etc. Salvador Dali and other great artists, musicians, Bach, they all had ways of getting in this hypnagogic space. And that's all we're talking about here, is getting into that space where you're really opening up to the creative forces of the universe. And that's where I would say we're truly encountering that one mind. Now, and this one mind concept, people need to know this is not just some new age woo woo, one mindy stuff. This is right at the leading edge of the boundaries of scientific study of consciousness in the current era. So, for example, if you go to Pim van Lommel's paper, he was the second place prize in the Bigelow Institute. He's a Dutch cardiologist, very scientific, so his paper is very scientific. At the end of it all, what you see is he gets to this one mind notion that is overwhelming modern consciousness studies. One mind is the powerful theme that really unites it all. And he mentions four great resources for that one mind idea. One of them is Larry Dossey's book, which I highly recommend. It's called One Mind, and it came out, I think, in 2013. It's one of the most beautiful examples that it's not just humans, but with all of life on Earth, we're sharing this kind of one mind. It's a very well written book. Another source he puts there is Steve Taylor's beautiful book on spiritual science. The third resource he mentions is Bernardo Kastrup's paper, The Universe in Consciousness, which appeared in 2018 in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. I believe that was the source. And then he mentions our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, as his fourth
Oh,
main
wow.
source of scientific evidence for the one mind hypothesis. And I would add to Pim Van Lommel's list of those four resources, I would add Pim Van Lommel's book, Consciousness Beyond Life, which he wrote several years earlier. And it is one of the most extraordinary unifications of science and spirituality I know of. So I highly recommend Pim Van Lommel's book. But I think all five of those resources, once you read them, you got one of the strongest scientific bases for this notion of the one mind. And it is really the way we're headed. We're not going to move away from this idea because all the evidence supports it so strongly. We will move forward and understand more deeply how it works. But the beauty of it is that the universe, that God force, loves all of us so dearly and realizes we all contribute to the dream of the one mind. So this is not about some Borg-like, coalescence of intelligence in the universe to where all of it becomes some kind of mind-numbing oneness of kind of a Borg-like mentality, but it's much more from the other direction, showing how each and every one of us, as a sentient being manifesting the forces of love, kindness, compassion, and mercy, can help bring this one mind power to the world in a way that will bring peace and harmony and prosperity to all. So it's an important revolution, especially given all the fits and starts of human civilization over the last few centuries, all of our confusion about this, the rise of materialist science, but then in the last century, its displacement by a much more unified version of one mind at the core of our thinking about the nature of the universe. And that's really where it's all headed. And in this era of modern warfare and violence, conflict, economic polarization, all the travesties in our world, it's high time that we grew up and truly became Homo sapiens. Sapiens means wise. But I would say when I look at our world, I don't see a whole lot of wisdom out there. And this revolution in science, with the focus on the one mind, how it's all coming together in many ways, is the next step in human evolution. And I think we're facing a revolution that will ultimately make the Copernican revolution, where mankind centuries ago realized that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but the sun might be the center. Of course, we've come a long way since then. But I would say that this revolution goes even further now, finally, the tremendous amount of growth and coalescence of our understanding over thousands of years coming together in this modern scientific revolution that focuses on the one mind and how we're all truly in this together.
I'm just kind of speechless, which isn't like me, because first of all, I'm feeling so overjoyed and so grateful and so humbled that you're here talking like this, because from a science of mind perspective, where I'm used to hearing what you're saying from ministers, from practitioners, from spiritual leaders and new thought teachers, and to hear this from you really directly from a scientific point of view, from a new scientific point of view, it feels just that that we are coming to that day when science and spirituality are agreeing with each other, and that science is waking up and growing up.
Well, that's a
Also,
very important point. And what I would stress is I'm not the lone wolf in the wilderness here.
no,
I've worked with
I
hundreds
know.
of scientists around the world who are all totally on board with this. And for your viewers, I would recommend go to GalileoCommission.org. That's one of the scientific groups. I'm on the scientific advisory board for Galileo Commission. And you'll find a manifesto there, very well written by Henry Wallach. And once you read that kind of thing, you start to understand that the scientific community at large is getting this and on board with it and working hard to refine how it all works. The other group I would recommend is the Scientific and Medicine Network out of England that David Lorimer runs, and sorry, Galileo, I think might not be spelled quite right there in your posting. It's
No, I
G-A-L-I.
haven't spelt it correctly, have I?
We need to try to get it right. But then
I
also
was
the
doing it
Science
in
and
a
Medicine
rush.
Network from David Lorimer is a very important resource. Um, I'll wait till you get that right, and then I'll mention another.
G-A-L-I.
Yes, Galileo commission.org, galileocommission.org.
Sorry, it's just because the
Galil.
internet is a little bit.
A little trouble.
Oh, okay. That should work. That should do it. So I wanted to show your website here and your books.
Okay.
Also, sorry, I know you're in the midst of just explaining something, but just so that we can get this here, because I feel that it's really important that viewers can see your books, and if you'd like to just talk through them a little bit, a couple of sentences on each.
Absolutely. Well,
and I think this was your first book that you wrote. Yes.
Right. Proof of Heaven. I think the important thing to point out, that's really my first attempt to share my story. And I think the important thing to point out about it is that, for one thing, it's been endorsed by a number of scientists around the world who study consciousness and other experiencers. But the important thing is that it spent almost two years at the top of the New York Times bestseller list, 42 weeks in the #1 position as the nonfiction title. And it's been published in more than 40 languages around the world. The reason I mention that is just to point out that it resonated with people. I've heard from thousands of other people who've had similar experiences. And so basically, my journey and my sharing of it helped people to come to grips with their own similar experience. And I think that is an important part of this. You know, I was never trying to claim that my experience was unique in any way. Although for the scientific community, the important part had to do with the meningitis, meningoencephalitis, because that's what makes it really important to the scientific community. But to the world at large, it ranks up there just with any other NDE story. They're out there by the thousands, hundreds of thousands, and they really help us to come to a deeper understanding. That's where I would send people to, for example, IANDS.org. That's the International Association of Near-Death Studies. And you can leave your own stories there. You can read thousands of others that have happened to other people. It basically shows us this is a very democratic process, this NDE. Millions of people have had them. Their lives have been transformed. They know the reality of this realm. And that's really where this literature can help people at large. Ken Ring, who is one of the founders of that IANDS group, way back in the 80s, wrote about how just knowing and reading about NDEs can help other people get the same kind of spiritual growth that people get out of having an NDE. And that's where I think Karen and I realized that you're not going to tell people about this so much as invite them to have it themselves. And that's why in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, the focus is really on helping people learn how to meditate and use sacred acoustics to get into deep states. Now, Map of Heaven, this is the second book that you're showing now. This followed Proof of Heaven. And Map of Heaven was more just my attempt to tell people, look, this isn't just Eben Alexander, a neurosurgeon from Harvard, having this experience, but people from everywhere over centuries, millennia, have had these very same experiences. And the commonalities mean we should pay attention to them. That's really the main value of Map of Heaven. It's not really a continuation of my story as much as my trying to say that my story is an example of something that commonly occurs. And that's why the third book, I think, is so important, and that's Living in a Mindful Universe. And that's the one where Karen and I, she's my co-author and life partner. She also, of course, as I mentioned earlier, was the co-founder of Sacred Acoustics. Now, I have no official financial arrangement with Sacred Acoustics, but she's a co-founder, so she does. And full disclosure, I have to say that. But I'm one of their biggest users. I use Sacred Acoustics an hour or two a day. I can't imagine life without it. I've been doing that for more than the last decade. because to me, it's a very powerful mode of going within. And of course, sacred acoustics has been fully supported by a scientific peer-reviewed pilot study that was published by Dr. Anna Yusim, Y-U-S-I-M. That was in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases in September of 2020. So if you look for Dr. Anna Yusim in that journal article, you will find a pilot study that basically supports sacred acoustics over 2 weeks as reducing anxiety symptoms in her patient population by 26% versus only 7% over 2 weeks in people who had talk therapy but no sacred acoustics tones. So 26% benefit over 2 weeks
Right.
versus 7% controls. That is amazing for anxiety. And anyway, but we're just trying to get it out there as a technique. But that's where the third book really goes, to put the science together in a very powerful way. It's been endorsed by some of the leading scientists in the world studying consciousness, people like Ed Kelly, Jim Tucker, Bruce Grayson, Bernardo Kastrup, Jeffrey Kripal. Others have really been beautiful supporters of that book, Living in a Mindful Universe. So want to get it out there.
Oh, it's beautiful. Everything is on your website, Dr. Eben Alexander. Everything is there. People can buy it there. And of course, you have your Facebook pages, Facebook groups. I'm going to put all of these links underneath in the post here, which will go out and be available for everybody to see exactly where to find you and your book offerings and your talks. I know that you travel a lot, or you have traveled so extensively talking about this and inspiring people to knowing the truth of who they are. I have a question for you. Do you believe that your experience, or this experience, was a healing experience, and that it was the thing that actually healed you?
Yes,
Through the
absolutely, totally. I believe it was the thing that healed me. I would attribute to God, to that God force of
Yes,
pure love and wholeness at the core of the
yes,
experience. That was the healing
yes.
force that
That's what I
allowed me to
wanted
come
to.
back to this world and share the story. And of course, you hear that from millions of indie ears. I'm nothing special at all. I'm just another indie ear who witnessed and bathed in the love of that infinitely healing force of God, of love, of togetherness. And I also came to realize that that very force is the source of our conscious awareness. None of us are ever separate from that. We
Right,
may kind of obscure the pathway in many different ways, but ultimately, that's what the NDE teaches us, is that we are all sourced in that beautiful, loving force. And to pretend that it's something separate from us is just because we're kind of buying into certain aspects of the illusion. We're here to learn and teach these profound lessons of love and connection. That's what this is really all about. But for me, the healing force was absolutely clear as that pure force of love and oneness at the core that I explained or tried to explain in my book, Proof of Heaven.
and that, of course, may not be able to explain scientifically that actual healing that happened
Well,
for
that's what
you.
we're interested in finding out. And there's so
Yeah,
much evidence for the benefit of prayer and healing. It's a hard thing to address scientifically because of certain decline effects and other kind of parapsychological or psychological effects that you run into in doing studies like that. And yet, when you look at kind of the spontaneous environment of prayers and healing, for example, two books I always recommend along these lines, both by Larry Dossey, who I think is a world-renowned expert in this field. One is called Healing Words. It's an excellent book, and the other is called Be Careful What You Pray For. And that is kind of an admonition of just how powerful our mind and our thoughts can be. So we really do need to be cautious about it all because we might get things that were kind of unintended. So at any rate, it's I think Larry Dossey's work and also Robert Koenig, Koenig from Duke University, has written beautifully on kind of the power of prayer and healing in a modern medical investigative environment. So I think there's some very good evidence out there that prayer can have tremendous power. We know that distance healing also, in certain meditative
Yes.
states, people who claim to be, quote, energy healers and things like that, can actually be quite effective at bringing healing in various settings. And in lab settings, that can even involve seed germination and bacterial growth. And prayers can be shown to actually have an influence in those settings. So it's something that we're just beginning to understand from a scientific fashion, and yet kind of from the broader theater of human experience, it seems quite clear that prayer and kind of accessing that mental aspect of the universe can have tremendous power in uncovering the world that we would like to engender.
Yes, and so we do have this power, and we are all responsible for how we tap or how we use or don't use this to the degree that we think that we can or we can't. So that's an unlearning as well, isn't it? That's an unlearning
Right.
experience, and
Well,
then
it
the
is.
access. Yeah, that can take time,
Well,
but
I
it's
think
all
that
part
that's the
of the.
Well, I'd say the important lesson here is we're learning, just as quantum physics has demonstrated so beautifully for many decades now, there seems to be a mental layer of the universe that provides a top-down causality. So that, in other words, if you expect, as some quantum physicists who are hardcore materialists might, that we're just trying to understand all those electrons, photons, quarks, all the particles, their interactions, physics, chemistry, biology, build up our understanding as if it's that bottom up causality.
Yeah.
What we're finding is no, that's not true. That there is a top down set of causal principles that really lead more readily to the events that we see emerging in our lives. And that's something that's fully consistent with quantum physics. Now, they try and explain it away by saying that there are infinite parallel universes and that every possible outcome occurs, but that your mind only takes one little pathway of outcomes. They don't begin to define how that set of outcomes is defined. But that's where I think that infinite parallel universes, Hugh Everett's kind of many worlds interpretation of quantum physics, really falls away as ridiculous because we don't seem to be living in that. We seem to have a consensus reality. But the best way to explain quantum physics in the context of this consensus reality is by realizing that mind over matter and that we're sharing that one mind. The brain is a filter for the one mind, but it's not the producer of mind. And that's where I would say modern books like Living in a Mindful Universe help take us to an entirely new level.
Thank you so much for being here. There is so much on here that I'm going to have to go back and listen a couple of times. And I'm inviting anybody that's watching right now, go back. If you joined a little way through, go back, listen from the beginning, because there is so much in here, information to teach us more from a scientific perspective of who we truly are. And that's what this is all about. Knowing that we're not
Absolutely.
relying on that outer experience to judge our lives by, and that
Right.
we are something so much greater, so much more than this. And ultimately, I feel this is love.
Well, it has a lot to do with bringing peace and healing and wholeness to this world at large, because I don't think anybody
Yes.
would doubt that right now the world's in quite a bit of trouble with climate change, with war and violence, conflict, nationalist and tribalist drums a beating. It's time for all of us to get on board that we're truly in this together. And to hurt another is to hurt ourselves. I mean, that's one of the most
Ourselves.
profound lessons from near death experiences. Karen and I often say that, the fact that you have life reviews, that you go into this, your life flashing before your eyes, but what you realize, you don't experience it from your perspective as in an NDE as much as the emotional perspective of those around you who are influenced by your thoughts
Okay.
and actions. And so it's like the golden rule is written into the very fabric of the universe through these life reviews. And it's an extraordinary lesson that we should all take to heart. And it's about the nature of reality. And we really need to grow up and mature as Homo sapiens and start taking much better care of each other and of
Yes.
all of our fellow sentient beings on this planet. So it's not just about human beings sharing one mind. All of our animal and plant friends are part of one mind too. Now, this is not a panpsychist approach. If you read our book, you'll realize we have a much more optimistic and powerful interpretation that's not so materialistic. It can be called, metaphysical idealism, or probably in its purest form, evolutionary panentheism, which is
and that is exactly the work of Ernest Holmes, the qualified non-dualistic panentheism.
Yeah, that's where I would say the answer is truly lying. But it leaves open the beautiful gift of our free will as sentient beings to manifest the dream of the one mind in the highest form of healing and wholeness.
This is so exciting.
Yes, it's very, very exciting. But
it's so exciting. We have beautiful listeners that have been leaving their comments all of this, and I haven't had, because the conversation's been so great, I haven't had a chance to stop and acknowledge. We have Bonnie here, who's mentioned quite a few times. We have about 4 minutes left, so I'm just going to acknowledge here. We have Facebook users saying yes, they've read Proof of Heaven. Awesome. There we go. And another here. There are so many. Tibetan brass bowls, right to my soul and heart. There we are. So we were talking about the effectiveness of vibration and frequency. And Wayne, of course, saying lots of love. And yes, this has been an amazing conversation, Dr. Eben. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing.
Oh, my pleasure.
I'd love
Thank you so much.
I'd love you to come back, and if you'd like to come back with Karen as well and talk, your partner. And
I would recommend that, because people who have heard Karen and me both realize she's the real brains behind this operation. So she's got a lot of incredible wisdom. She's one of my spiritual mentors. She's been very important to me. So yes, I would say it would be very useful to your audience if we had Karen on too. She is just a beautiful breath of fresh air in this discussion and can add a lot of personal experience. So let's do that.
Let's do that. Let's invite you and Karen back as guests in Cosmic Prayer at some point in the year, and you can share more, and Karen can give her perspective of how sound can really, really, really help us to access the infinite. I'd really be interested in that, and I'm sure the viewers here would as well.
Well, excellent. Well, let's plan on it. And blessings to your audience. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for having me on. It's been a real joy.
Oh, it's been great. And thank you for being here. And thank you for everybody that's been viewing and watching and listening. If you're catching on the podcast or on YouTube or on Facebook, this will be available in many, many places for you. And thank you for being here, and for all of your comments and everything that you have, that you've been part of in this wonderful conversation here on the Cosmic Prayer. Of course, the Cosmic Prayer is
have me on.
Been great. Dr. Eben Alexander III. It's been magical. And I know there's a lot more that wants to come through. And so I really look forward to you coming back here and joining us on New Thought Media Network. And of course, New Thought Media Network. Yes, great. New Thought Media Network is an amazing focus ministry, Centers for Spiritual Living focus ministry that is here serving humanity with programming like this every day of the week, allowing us to get closer and deeper to that truth, that wisdom of that knowing. And I'm going to pop this up here. This is the donation button. If you feel connected with this and you love the work that we are doing here, then you can go along to ntmedia.org, find the donate button, be woven into the consciousness of this. You know, we know that God is our source and supply here. And so we put this into action with sharing and knowing that as we give, we receive, of course. We're in a recipient. So thank you to New Thought Media Network. Thank you to the doggies in the perfect timing.
Yeah, the doggies have a lot to say about this. They love this notion of one mind. We're all in it together.
We love the one mind. Thank you, Dr. Eben.